Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. Thursday, July 20th. We're more than 3 months away from any meaningful college basketball being played, but it's never a bad time to talk college hoops with today's guest, one of my favorite Big Ten hoops writers out there. He runs UMHoops.com. Dylan Burkhardt, welcome back to Podcast on the Brink.
Thanks for having me, Alex. Excited to talk hoops. I think I saw a tweet. We're almost at the midway point of the offseason. And I'll tell you, it has been a long first half of an offseason, as long as I can remember. Just madness all around.
Yeah, we've talked about this a little bit. We talk pretty often just about how, from covering college basketball, how much it's changed in the last couple of years with the transfer portal. Do you like it as somebody that follows college basketball as closely as you do? Do you like this kind of, I've kind of compared it to NBA free agency, that we have kind of this frenzy now starting when the tournament starts with the portal opening and then really going to the end of May. I guess for views and for interest in the sport, it's good, but for it's also kind of, to me, I almost felt like I was busier once the season ended than I was down the stretch run of the season.
Yeah, it's definitely different. I as someone who just likes kind of thinking about college basketball, I like the transfer portal sort of scouting process a lot more than maybe scouting high school recruits and things like that. Like, I find it more interesting to think about how this player will fit in this system, or whether this player is a good fit for this team or can make the jump up a level and things like that. To me, that sort of stuff is, you can make more meaningful insights, I think, out of that, and really like watching film of players actually playing college basketball, not trying to say, oh, wow, this kid is going to be the best high schooler ever. Like, I think there's so much hyperbole that gets drawn into high school recruiting, and there's a sort of like realism that's stuck to transfer recruiting, where I can actually watch this kid play games. So you can't really blow smoke quite as much. And I like that part of it. But it's definitely like, there was the crazy April where everyone was talking about the portal, but I feel like July recruiting is just not really what it was from the high school perspective at all. Like, and it's hard to even think about, like 2025 recruiting. Like, what's this kid? What does this mean for your program? You have no idea. There's just so much uncertainty. So I like evaluating the transfer portal. It's certainly, I hear the argument about, okay, like following players through their careers and the kind of roster changeover can be hard for fans. I get that, but I don't know. I like the just thinking about portal prospects and how they'll end up at new places.
Yeah, I think it just definitely changes for every program how they're going to recruit moving forward, because you have, even if you strike out, we kind of saw this with Indiana last season. I wouldn't say they struck out completely on their high school recruiting class, but they only landed 2 guys. But then they had the opportunity in the portal, and then also for the third straight year, they have like a higher ranked recruit decommit or part ways with the school. So it kind of, I think it used to be there was a lot of pressure by November if you didn't have your class kind of set up. What are you going to do the next year? Now with the portal and just all the movement that we've seen, I think it gives programs a little bit more flexibility when they're building rosters. One of those programs I want to talk about here at the top, and then we'll also get into Big Ten topics, just kind of some of the teams in the league. Michigan, obviously, you cover as closely as anybody. Been a bit of a tumultuous, I guess that's an appropriate word, for the Wolverines offseason. Kobe Buffkin, Jett Howard, both picked in the NBA draft. Hunter Dickinson leaves, goes to the transfer portal, has a bunch of drama with where he's going to end up, ultimately chooses Kansas. So Indiana will see him next year in Assembly Hall, just not in a Michigan uniform. Caleb Love commits to the Wolverines, then I guess decommits or isn't admitted, however you want to characterize that, isn't going to end up there. The Michigan is kind of still piecing together its roster. I think there's still some scholarship spots open. And I sent you yesterday kind of the current Bart Torvik projections for the Big Ten next season. He's got Michigan the 11th highest ranked team, which doesn't mean a whole lot as we sit here in July, on July 20th. A lot can happen, and that obviously order is not set in stone. But Michigan's offseason, tumultuous. Would you agree with that? And how do you just kind of project where this roster is going into next season and its chances to be getting back to the tournament, which I think a lot of people want to see after the miss last year?
Yeah, I'm not sure tumultuous even does it justice. It was a very eventful offseason, right? You lose your three best players. You have this big, splashy Caleb Love commitment. Then you have a month of rumors about his eventual decommitment. Then you have like the Olivier Kamwa recruitment was a pretty wild ride in itself. He's probably going to end up being potentially Michigan's best player. He's a 6'9" kind of power forward, can play a little up, can play more of like a true four. He's coming from Tennessee. He had some big games last year. I think he had 27 against Duke in the NCAA tournament. Also had like more than a dozen single-digit games. So he wasn't the most consistent player, but clearly talented. Went through the NBA draft process, eliminated Michigan from his recruitment, added Michigan back to his recruitment, ended up at Michigan in the end. And he's a guy that Michigan had to have because really they need kind of just some sort of semblance of a go-to player on the roster. And I do think he can provide that. He has a really interesting skill set. He's actually over in Finland right now. He's going to play with their FIBA World Cup team. And that'll be interesting to see how he looks at that level. But so it's been a tumultuous offseason. I think you can say, like, I like the Kamwa addition. I think Namari Burnett coming over from Alabama is a pretty like smart addition. He's a really good defensive player who's been injury prone, but is still a former All-American. This could be something there. He's a grad transfer with multiple years left. Like, that's a smart addition. Same with Trey Jackson. He's kind of this former top 100 recruit who's never quite figured it out, but he's 6'10". You watch his highlights and you'll be like, why isn't he in the NBA? Obviously, he has some parts of his game to smooth out. Needs to find the right role, but he's a 6'10" guy who can slash, shoot threes. So the additions make sense, and it'd be great. Like, they'd be great additions for any team, and they fill a lot of holes that I think you could say last year's roster had, right? Like, Michigan didn't have strong play at the power forward spot. Michigan lacked wing depth. Michigan lacked all these things, but you're plugging holes from last year's roster while the whole boat just goes under, right? Like, it's not really, like, you need to figure out a completely new identity. And so that's going to really be the thing for this Michigan team is you have to just look at it kind of from scratch and say, all right, Doug McDaniel and Terrace Reed come back. They're going to be kind of your 1-5 core. And I think Terrace Reed, obviously not close to the player that Hunter Dickinson was as far as stats and accolades, but okay, he can probably be a pretty good defensive anchor. You add in guys like Burnett and Kamwa. They both played in top 5 defenses last year. And you're like, okay, maybe this is more of a team that plays kind of like Northwestern did last year, where you're just going to play really good defense. Scoring is not really going to be easy, but you figure it out as you go. And I think that's kind of where Michigan's at. I think they are probably one player short right now. Really that Caleb Love spot at the 2. They need like a volume scorer. They've been tied to Jose Perez. He's kind of a 6'6" combo guard forward type of player who put up huge numbers at Manhattan, but has not really ever done it at the high major level. But that's kind of where Michigan's at. And like you said, like making sense of what this is all going to look like is really hard because these new players are all going to play huge roles. And basically you have 2 sophomores coming back who are going to have to step up their game in a big way.
There's some parallels, I feel like, with Michigan and Indiana, just in terms of you have a player leaving Indiana that the program was so dependent on for the last 4 years in Trace Jackson Davis. Michigan, kind of the same thing with Hunter Dickinson. They built their team around him for the last 3 years, and now he's gone. Does that open up some things in terms of how this team plays differently moving forward? Is that a reason maybe for potential optimism? I know Indiana fans are kind of looking ahead, and I'm not saying that in any way they're excited that Trace is gone, but I think they're just interested to see maybe how the style of play looks different moving forward. How do you think? What do you think the biggest ways are that Michigan will look different in the post Hunter Dickinson era when the ball tips off next November?
Yeah, it's one of those things where in the offseason, it's great to think about, wow, we were stuck with all these holes because Trace Jackson Davis couldn't shoot or Hunter Dickinson couldn't play defense. But man, everyone loved it when they would go and drop 30 points and carry you to a win. So it's easy to, depending on your mood, you can hone in on different parts of that. But I think the thing with Michigan is definitely going to be the defense. I think there's a ceiling to how good you can be defensively with Hunter Dickinson as your starting center. And I think if you have just truly elite defenders at every spot, we saw his freshman year, like Michigan was a really good defensive team. But the reality is that he's not going to be a guy that impacts a lot of shots at the rim. He's not going to be a very mobile guy. And I think Terrace Reed showed in limited time like some real defensive upside. And he's still just kind of figuring it out at that point last year. So I think the hope for Michigan is there's a real chance to be a much better defensive team. The problem is, like, Hunter Dickinson just gave you an automatic double team on 75% of possessions that you just got in the ball. And that's a huge, like, without something like that, you have to work so much harder to score offensively. And that's where the trade-off is going to come.
How surprised were you at Dickinson's decision to leave? I know it's something that Michigan fans maybe were caught off guard by, but then when some of the reporting in the aftermath came out about NIL and different things like that, maybe not being the same at Michigan as what you could get at Kansas, obviously, how surprised were you that he chose to move on? And how much of that do you feel was, I'm not asking you to speculate here, but just based on what you know, how much of that do you think was based on the NIL component?
So Hunter Dickinson has always sort of done things his own way. Like, after his freshman year, he declared for the draft and, like, supposedly very seriously considered it, even though very few people, like, viewed him as a pro, things like that. He did graduate this offseason, so, like, he went through his 3 years. I think it's just really a culmination of a lot of things, like I think frustration over how the last both of the last 2 seasons had kind of been a grind. Nothing ever quite clicked the way it did when he was a freshman. You add in the NIL and really the sort of idea of, and I think this is pretty common across the sport, but I would be surprised if the majority of players last year who were, like, just returning to their teams made more NIL money than they were hoping to make. I think that's kind of something you could say confidently across the sport. And that just gets magnified. Add in that the transfer portal has become this way to make significantly more money. And I think it's just the decision that he made. And I think it's fair to make, like, it makes sense for him in a personal sense. But I completely surprised. No, it sort of felt like something had to come of this whole, like, Hunter Dickinson chapter. And it was kind of at a point where it had run its course, I would say. So I get it in a lot of ways. It'll be really interesting to see how he plays at Kansas and how that works out, right? Because technically he has 2 years of eligibility remaining.
How will Michigan fans, like, view him historically, just in terms of what he did for the program? Is it like a thank you? Hey, you graduated, you did your thing, move on? Or will he, obviously Trace Jackson Davis is kind of a rare, him and Zach Edey really, I think, are going to kind of be rare in college basketball, that, like, that All-American type player that stays at a program for maybe this will be Edey's 4th year. That I don't think we're going to see that very often moving forward in college basketball. With Dickinson, obviously there's going to be appreciation for what he did, but then him leaving, I mean, does that kind of soften how he's viewed by Michigan fans moving forward at all?
Yeah, I would say he's done about everything he could do over the last 3 months to burn it to the ground. He's just seemed to go out of his way.
Just with stuff what he said on podcasts, or what?
Well, yeah, like transferring, obviously, like, no one's going to be super excited about a guy when he leaves, right? Like, it's kind of unprecedented to have a guy that good just straight up transfer and leave, right? So there's that part of it. And then there's just kind of the fact that he's kind of just throwing casual shots at Michigan over the last 6 weeks in podcasts. Like, I can't imagine that stuff's going to slow down either. So I would expect that there's not a lot of excitement from many Michigan fans to want to, like, celebrate his accomplishments at this point. And you go out with a bad season, right? Like, it's not like Michigan, right, you're going to have that as kind of the memory in your, like, the lasting memory of the year is what his last home game was against Toledo and then NIT. Like, no one's really excited to celebrate that.
Yeah. Big Ten at large, I want to dig into. Obviously, we're probably going to get into top 25 player list mode here in the next month to 6 weeks, which getting harder and harder by the year. Maybe I don't know. I mean, we keep saying that, but every year we come up with 25 players, and if you look back, I think we probably did a fairly good job last year. But this year, kind of feels like nationally the conversation is Purdue, Michigan State, and then everybody else, a kind of a clump of teams there that we don't really know what's going to happen beyond that. Do you kind of agree with that assessment right now? Is Purdue and Michigan State at the top and then everybody else?
Yeah, I think those have to be the top two teams. I think as much of that is, I have no idea who would be the third team. Like I think it's up for debate where Michigan State falls in that spectrum. I think they're the second best team, but I don't know if they're closer to Purdue or closer to the Pac. And I think that's sort of the big question with them, whereas they're a team that made the Sweet 16 last year, but to be honest, like the 3 straight years outside of the Ken Pom top 25, they haven't quite clicked to the level we want. So I wonder if the things that gave that team problems last year, right, like being able to create easy offense inside the arc, are going to be problems again this year. But the class is great. They bring a lot of people back. I think Tyson Walker is awesome. Like I want to see him be awesome all the time. Like take it to like that 30% usage, like be a star kind of guy, right? Like he has done that in spots and has these huge games, but he's not really been like productive at that level every game. So for me, Michigan State is the clear number 2. And I think they have more upside probably than any team in the league, but it's just, I think there's still some questions about where they fall relative to the Pac.
How does that guard situation play out in East Lansing? Because it seems to me a little bit crowded, and you obviously have some one big personality there, and AJ Hoggard, who's obviously I would expect that he's coming back with the expectation that he's going to be the starter, but you've also got a highly talented freshman coming in Jeremy Fears. You've got Akins, who kind of seems like he's always seemed like he's on the verge of a breakout, like the talent's there, but it hasn't necessarily happened. And you've got Tyson Walker, who's kind of the man on that rush. That seems like a lot of pieces to kind of fit together for those minutes. How do you see that kind of playing out? Do you see potential problems with minutes there and how that all works out, or does Tom Izzo kind of get the benefit of the doubt of being able to figure it all out?
So there's definitely a log jam, right? You got to add in Trey Holloway, who played some, or right. Holloway, played some minutes last year too.
Forgot about him. So,
like, it's created this weird situation where, like, Hoggard is your point guard, Tyson Walker is your scoring guard, Jaden Akins, he's a 6'4" guy who was like a top 50 recruit. Like, he's played as a wing over the last couple of years, right? Like, he's basically in that run the wing, shoot threes, slash off the catch. He doesn't really get kind of that ball screen involvement as like more of a 2 guard. And now you're going to add Fears into that, and I don't know what that means for Fears as a freshman or what the expectation was for Fears as a freshman, but I think in a way Hoggard coming back sort of holds back Tyson Walker from becoming this mega star that he only is every 3 games instead of every game, and it kind of holds back Jaden Akins from, okay, can he become like a pro 2 guard, or is he going to just sort of be in this role? So I think there are questions about maybe like certain players reaching their ceiling, but at the same time, like it's a good problem to have to deal with too many good guards. Like you can figure that out. And there is kind of a hole, I would say, on the wing, right? So I think it's going to be more of a 3 guard look, which it was last year with Akins quite a bit, but I'll be curious how they sort that out, because the one X factor in all this is they ran a ton of offense for Joey Hauser, right? Like he was the guy they're running sets for quite a bit. They run a lot of like sets to get him jump shots and things like that. So who's going to get all those looks? And that might be a way that you can get more production out of Akins, even if he's still kind of an off the ball guy. But we'll see. Like too many point guards is probably the best problem to have if you're a head coach. So I think they can figure it out. But I do feel like the star, like it just sort of has held back. Like Tyson Walker, we see him against Kansas State or whatever, and it's like, this guy needs to be like the best guard in the Big Ten. And then we see a game where AJ Hoggard just dominates the ball or does whatever else. And it's like, well, I'm not as into that. So we'll see.
Yeah. Purdue, do they need to change anything moving forward about how they play? I mean, they've obviously been a punchline, I guess, nationally for obviously losing to a 16 seed, but you look at just the body of work that they put together last year in the regular season. There's really nothing to kind of look and say they overachieved. I think based on their preseason expectation, had a great season. Ultimately, I kind of feel like they're going to have this kind of burden on them until they break through and finally make it to a Final Four. But you can't really take anything away from what they built as a regular season team for many years in a row. I think Matt Painter's figured out kind of the formula to be successful in the Big Ten. Do they make any changes, notable changes going forward, or does it just kind of keep plugging along with what you're doing and let's see what happens in terms of potentially breaking through?
I mean, they just bring so much back that and a lot of guys who are young who should obviously just get a little bit better, and they were also way better than really anyone else in the league last year. Like, I think it's
well, you had them winning, right? I think you were the only one.
I picked them last year to win the league,
right?
So
right.
I think they're going to be better than they were last year, and I think obviously the NCAA tournament thing will be what it is until they win a few games in the tournament, and then everyone will put that to bed or not, whatever. It'll just be something you talk about. But I think that how a team played in the NCAA tournament should be one of the last things you consider when you predict how they'll play this year. And the body of work, like you say, like someone like Trey Kaufman-Renn could take a huge step, and then all of a sudden you have a better backup big. I think Lance Jones bringing some athleticism in as a point guard or as a guard transfer makes sense. I think Lawyer and Braden Smith should be better. I think I've heard good things about Miles Colvin, who I think is one of their freshman wings. So
yep.
You got First back, you got Gillis back, you got experience, you have the best player in the country. Like, I don't really know why you're gonna doubt this team being the best in the league at this point. And yeah, maybe you don't pick them first in the country because they fell on their face, but the reality is that can happen to any. It didn't hurt them during the season, so why would you not think they're going to be one of the best teams all year?
Right. I agree with you that not to change anything. I think just the reason that they're being viewed like that is they've had so many stumbles now in a row. But I think that's also kind of the nature of the beast of the tournament, right? Anything can happen. That's Indiana fans are, well, when are they going to make the second weekend? When are they going to, make a Sweet 16 and Elite 8? Well, last season they run into Miami, who goes on to make the Final Four. So much of it is just who's playing the best at that particular time. And obviously Purdue had a terrible night and Fairleigh Dickinson had a great night. And, that's just kind of, it's unfortunate, I guess, for Matt Painter that it's happened, so many years in a row, but I don't think you can take anything away in terms of what he's been able to build there and the sustained success. I'd take being a number one seed going into the tournament any year and take your chances with that.
Yeah. Like, think about it like this. Maybe playing through a guy like Zach Edey does make you susceptible to a bad shooting game in the NCAA tournament when guys triple team, quadruple team him, whatever. You're still going to optimize your chances in the NCAA tournament this year by doing the exact same thing and getting a one seed again and hoping that shit doesn't happen. Like, it's pretty obvious. Like, I don't know. I don't think they need to make any big changes. I think they made they're just moving forward. I think this should be a better team. Like, the roster is better. I don't know. I get it. And I think, sure, doubt Purdue in the NCAA tournament. But right now, pick Purdue as a one seed when you're doing your little preseason bracketology because it's going to be a good team.
So the middle there in the Big Ten is kind of where I really want to kind of get your thoughts on what to make of this whole situation. I mean, you can go team by team and figure out one or two holes on each roster, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Northwestern, Maryland, Ohio State, Iowa, Nebraska, Michigan, Rutgers. Those are all you could talk yourself into picking any of those teams to make the tournament next year. And obviously not all of them are going to. Of that group, who maybe do you feel like has the best chance to maybe be that third or fourth best team in the Big Ten? And who do you think maybe is going to underperform based on just where they are? And you've got the Torvik rankings in front of you, just kind of the same as I do. Not paying too much of attention to that at this point, but I just named, let's see, 10 teams. So obviously not going to all make the tournament, but I think each of those fan bases is probably, I'm sure there's somebody in Piscataway saying, oh, we probably have a chance to make the tournament next year. Same thing in Columbus and Lincoln, Nebraska, all these different teams, just based on what they have on their roster right now. But obviously, that's not going to happen for all of them.
Yeah, so I do think there's not a lot of separation between these teams. And I think a big part of it is that a lot is going to come down to how some of these incoming transfers really fare, right? Like if AJ Storr is the best transfer wing in the conference, like Wisconsin should be a pretty damn good team. The one I look at though, and this might sound crazy, and I'm going to just go ahead and say it, Ohio State. I think you look at Ohio, I'd love to look at teams that just were worse or like had worse results than they actually were as a team the previous years where everything went wrong. But I look at Ohio State and I think they have talent. They have young guards coming back. They bring in Jamison Battle, who like no one seems to be talking about. If he's healthy, he can make shots. They have bigs. They have some freshmen that I think are pretty intriguing. Like they've generally been a top third team in the league. I think they're a team that certainly relative to expectations, you could look at to overachieve. I don't know if they're going to finish third or something like that, but I would just look at them in this kind of middle group and say, people are just going to act like they're going to be terrible because their season was such a disaster. But I think there's some talent there. I think there's enough to surprise. That'd be one I'd pick out. I don't know if I'm going to go all the way and say third. I'm very curious. Illinois and Wisconsin are kind of those two near the top, where Illinois, I'm kind of in on their transfers coming in, but not like completely convinced. And obviously bringing back Terrence Shannon Jr., like he, one of probably the few players who could have a player of the year type season other than Zach Edey. And like, they were just so dysfunctional. They don't have a point guard. I'm like, well, that's scary stuff. So it's a weird situation. Whereas Wisconsin's opposite. Everything's there, but they were just so thoroughly mediocre last year. I don't know if AJ Storr alone can make them a better offensive team, or are they just going to be the same group they were last year?
Yeah, a couple of the teams I think I have the biggest questions about are Northwestern, just based on it felt like everything went right for them last year. The losing Chase Audige, which still kind of a head scratcher for me that he would, just kind of forego his last season, and maybe obviously he's probably going to end up somewhere overseas. I don't know what the NIL situation is at Northwestern, but it seemed like that was an opportunity for him to come back and have another really strong year for them, but he moves on. And then Iowa, to me, it kind of feels like every year we're saying, well, Iowa's going to maybe take a step back. And then, it went from Luka Garza being gone to, oh, okay, well, Keegan Murray's kind of that next guy. Well, he turns into a lottery pick. And then Chris Murray turns into a first-round pick. I look at their roster. I don't necessarily see an NBA player on the roster, so I kind of feel like this might be the year where things start to trend downward. Do you kind of share same feelings on both of those teams going into next season?
You're not you're not going to the next set of brothers here with the Sanford brothers as the breakout stars here. Probably. I
don't think one of them's going to turn into Wieskamp. Do you?
I think Peyton Sanford could have a huge year. I think like the way they play will, and with him as that featured scorer, I think he'll be like the guy who scores 15 points a game or something crazy like that for that team, just because they're going to score. You could put whoever out there with Fran and he's going to get them points. And I think Sanford has that big game scoring ability. He was kind of fought through it a bit last year at different points, but he's shown, I think, enough potential to be that guy. Add in his brother, who will probably take a bunch of shots. Like, I think they're going to score. I think the big guy they got in and out of the portal is like a solid sort of
from Valpo, right?
Yeah, similar kind of feel to what they had in Rabracha, where he's not sort of this explosive guy, but he can get you 10 points down low, good footwork, catches the ball. Like, it's just going to be Iowa. They're not going to guard anyone. But okay, like, I don't know. I think there was sort of this moment where Iowa had leading into like that Garza Murray transition that around there where they were like, Iowa can be a Big Ten contender. I think this is more of Iowa can scrape their way into the NCAA tournament because they score 100 points at home in the 4 games in the Big Ten, and they steal one on the road where they shoot 45% from 3. And it's just kind of one of those more old school Fran McCaffrey teams.
What about Northwestern?
I'm with you on selling Northwestern. They made defensive improvements, but they overachieved, like wins loss wise, versus how good they actually were as a team, I think. And I think Audige is probably one of the more underrated players in the league the last few years, just because of how good he was defensively. I don't know if you can make that up with what I think they ran, like Ryan Langborg from Princeton. Like I don't see it there, but we'll see.
I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about Indiana on an Indiana podcast. Obviously, they're fourth right now in Torvik's rankings in terms of national ranking, but they lose as much as anybody. Well, maybe not quite as much as Michigan, but Trace Jackson Davis, Race Thompson, Miller Kopp, Jalen Hood Schifino, Tamar Bates transferred, Jordan Geronimo transferred, and there's a ton of new guys that have come in. There's a late addition of Mackenzie Mbako here in the spring. Obviously, there's high expectations for him. Really, for me, kind of hard to make sense of what Indiana is going to be next season. It's kind of like, let's throw all these ingredients in the pot and stir it up and see what happens. We have no idea what it's going to turn into, but it feels like at least the talent's there to sustain, maybe get back to another NCAA tournament. But I think the biggest questions for me are kind of, it feels like they needed maybe a wing, a two guard to score to plug in there somewhere. Trey Galloway coming back, but there's going to be a lot riding on guys like Khalil Ware, Malik Renew to make major steps forward, and that's kind of the unknown for me.
Yeah, I see like mock drafts with Khalil Ware as a top 10 pick, and I'm like, well, sure, if that's the case, then sure, maybe Indiana will be really fun. He seemed like he didn't even play a ton for Oregon last year, so I don't know what to. Indiana to me is just Michigan in a different color and a team I don't follow as well, so I have no idea how to really make up from down. Like, do I think Malik Renew could be really good? Yeah. Do I think a Malik Renew, Ware, and Mbako trio at the 3-4-5 is like the perfect Big Ten lineup? Like, I'm a little uncertain about that, but look, the talent's there. Like who's going to be the Big Ten freshman of the year? It could be like you could have the top draft pick and the top freshman in the league on that roster. So sure, I can believe like Xavier Johnson. There's going to be a lot of Big Ten point guards who have done less than him and are younger than him that are going to be picked to probably be better than him. And I think he's still a pretty good guy at this point to bring back, just with everything he's been through. I was never really the biggest Xavier Johnson fan, but for this team, sure. Like I think the pieces are there to put something together, but I have a very hard time knowing what it looks like, especially because it's so similar to Michigan without Hunter. Like, what does Mike Woodson basketball look like without Trace Jackson Davis? There are points when it was Trace Jackson Davis last year. That was the entire show. You were watching the one-man show. So good pieces. I agree. Like, who's the scoring two guard? Same thing Michigan's probably asking itself. Like, I don't know how you're creating that offense there. So we'll see. I would want to ask you more questions, like how all these pieces are going to fit together, because it's hard to say at this point.
Yeah, that's the same thing for me. I don't know. I mean, they've got, I think, some depth issues at the guard position that they're going to have to figure out. I mean, I think Gabe Cupps obviously is going to maybe play spot minutes behind Xavier Johnson, but then my kind of question is who backs up Trey Galloway. Is Mbako going to play the three? I mean, it seems like that's the plan to me. I don't know how that, how that looks. I don't know how good of a defender he's going to be. He's 6'7", 6'8". Is he going to be able to guard? They play Michigan State and Akins is playing the three. Is he going to guard? How's that going to work trying to guard a guard on that end? There's a lot of questions like that for me. And then Malik Renew, I kind of agree with you. Like, thinking about him for like the top 25 players list going into next season, he's like a guy that I would probably look at to maybe be somewhere on that list. And then I'll look at how many times he fouled last season, and you look at his fouls per 40 minutes, and you're like, this is a serious problem. And I don't know how he,
that's fixable.
Well, we'll see. We'll see if it's. I mean, it was a pretty high number, and then I also just kind of wonder going back to the backup guard position, CJ Gunn or Ja'Kai Newton, one of those guys is going to play. CJ Gunn shot, I think, something like 8 or 10% from three last year, which it was a limited sample size, but he's got to be better than that. And Newton's had some injuries. So, I think the talent's there, and I agree with you. What's Indiana basketball going to look like without Trayce Jackson-Davis under Mike Woodson? He talks about wanting to get up and down the floor more and shoot more threes, but I just don't see who's going to shoot more threes on this team and how the style of play is going to be. I mean, maybe Khalil Ware takes some threes and plays a little bit on the perimeter, but I don't know. They're to me, one thing that's really limited their upside, at least in recent seasons, really since Tom Crean's been gone, just how few threes they take in general as a team, and they just don't seem to emphasize it. And I don't really see how they've addressed that. Is that fair?
Yeah, some of that is just as simple as Trayce Jackson-Davis doesn't shoot threes, and Trayce Jackson-Davis took more shots than basically anyone in the league, right? So you're going to be, when you have a post-up guy, you're going to shoot fewer threes, I think. So I get that part of it. I just am curious because the front court depth seems really good. They're going to be big, so I think maybe
right. I didn't even mention Walker and Sparks. I mean Sparks seems like a decent add for. I mean, he's obviously transferring up, but he was a capable player in the MAC. So
I feel like there's something there to be sort of a formidable frontline defense, like defend the rim, and you go from there. You figure it out. So I think that there's enough talent there to put something together. A lot is going to come down to Xavier Johnson, I would say, right? Can he be that sort of super senior, dominate the ball screen guy? Probably. But what level can he get the team to? That's probably my question with that. And what you can get out of Ware. All I hear is that Ware's this epically talented guy who just has no motor. You better get that out of him, because if you don't, he's just going to kind of, he'll probably still go to the NBA draft after a year, but you're not going to get any of the benefit out of his ability in that short season, I would say.
Yeah, I don't know all the circumstances of the situation at Oregon, but it kind of seemed like he got a chance early in the year, and then they had two other, I think, McDonald's All-American type bigs that were older than him that played ahead of him. But yeah, it's kind of for him, it's maybe a make or break season in terms of his NBA draft stock, because if he doesn't figure it out after this year, then the older you get, the less appealing you become for the NBA, and then all of a sudden you're in college 3 years, and it's hard to see him becoming a first round pick if he doesn't figure it out this season. The last thing I wanted to ask you about, you kind of mentioned this earlier, Zach Edey is going to be a surefire. We can go ahead and put him in ink on our preseason top 25 Big Ten player list as number one. You mentioned Terrence Shannon Jr. as a guy who has, the talent, maybe the opportunity to have a player of the year type season, even if maybe it's a foregone conclusion that Edey wins it again. Who else in the league are you maybe looking at as, when we start to formulate this list, guys that you think will be, top 5, top 10 players? Just off, Jameer Young is another one at Maryland that I think a lot of people are excited about. Tyson Walker. Anybody else that maybe we haven't mentioned that you're looking at?
Yeah, so Shannon to me is the obvious one. And then Young was those guys were both first team all Big Ten guys last year. I tend to think, I don't know if Jameer Young can have a better season than he had last year. I think I just kind of see that as what he is, a first team all Big Ten player, really good year. I feel like Shannon might have another level up in the right situation. If Illinois is better than they were last year because the pieces fit together better, I just think there's something there, and he's ridiculous. He's old now, he's experienced. I think he's really good. He can be the best wing in the league by far. Yeah, Boo Booey, sure. I think I would rather look down the list and think about guys who could more be breakout type of guys. Tyson Walker, I do think, can he take that Cassius Winston style leap where he's hunting his shot every game, not just when they're coming back or when they're in a close game? I felt like his dominant stretches are as impressive as anyone, and he's probably as good of a off the dribble shot maker as there is in the league. but he has not had the usage up in the high 20s. It's been closer to 20. And it's hard to see that going up when they have more mouths to feed, right? You have Xavier Booker, you have all these guards, you have all these guys who are going to take shots. So we'll see about that. Man, like going down the list, it's kind of hard. Like I do think Olivier Kamwa could have like a second team all Big Ten season. That's kind of outside that player of the year range. Someone like Bruce Thornton at Ohio State, could he be a breakout guard? You got to kind of have some deep polls. I think it's really Edey, Shannon, and then 3 spots that everyone else in the league is fighting for.
Yeah, I mean, like none of the Wisconsin guys. I mean, they'll probably be somewhere on the. So you have to throw one or two of them on there, but none of them really excite you. I mean, Boo Buie, you mentioned. I don't know kind of what the next level is for him. Nebraska has, I think, Tominaga coming back. I mean, he's probably going to be in there somewhere. Figuring out some of the, Indiana's probably going to have a couple of guys somewhere on the list, but figuring out who exactly would belong to be on the list is tough. All these teams, I mean, Rutgers, Omori, he's back, right? So maybe he fits in somewhere, but just kind of feels like a year where maybe we have a first team all Big Ten player kind of emerges as things. You maybe mentioned a guy that from Iowa that could develop into that, and Sanford. We'll see how that all shakes out, but never a bad time to talk. Go ahead.
One thing I was going to say is I look at the sophomore. This is where I would look. The sophomores like coming back in the league this year, and I think you'll have guys from that list who really emerge to another level. Whether it's a Sejan, whether it's Thornton, Doug McDaniel, Khalil Ware, Pharrell Payne, Malik Renew. You said
Terrace Reed.
Yeah. Terrace Reed, Felix Akpara, like AJ Storr. Like there's a pretty good sophomore class building here in the league. And I think 1 or 2 of those guys will take a big leap because they have the talent. And I think some of them are going to be in a lot better situations.
Agreed. Dylan, never a bad time to talk Big Ten basketball with you. Thanks for taking the time on a Thursday morning in July. Still a lot of time to go before this season tips off. Hopefully we'll have the Big Ten schedule here in a month and a half or so, and can start looking a little bit closer at the season. As I said, we'll at some point here in the offseason have our top 25 Big Ten players list. You can follow Dylan at UMHoops on all the social media platforms. Check out his work at umhoops.com. Thanks again, Dylan, for the time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's fun talking hoops.
As for Podcast on the Brink, we will be back soon with another episode. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a rating on Spotify, and we'll talk to you again soon. Everyone have a great weekend.